Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's episode, we're going to be covering the single most dangerous question in trauma. Now, you can probably guess what it is. It's kind of the hallmark question of our entire species. And no, it's not, would you like fries with that? The question is why? You know, to start it off, really, why is such a natural question to ask? At least for human beings. It's science. Asking why has allowed us to uncover the secrets of the universe. It's given our species incredible insights into some of the most complex, if not the most complex, ecospheres and biospheres in the world or universe. The pursuit of this one question, why, has even let us send real-life people and even a few monkeys into space. But there is one place where the curious, penetrating nature of why can and usually does become the source of lots of pain and suffering. And more importantly, it causes us to get stuck. And when we're stuck in that, we get stuck in pain and suffering. The place where we have to be insanely careful about what we ask is trauma. Why is the single most dangerous question that you can ask in trauma, especially complex trauma? And we're going to get into why. So that's today's episode. Often when we are thinking about trauma, we're thinking about our own trauma. And by we, I mean the people that are listening to me right now. And the people who are listening to me right now are not 5 years old. They're not 7 years old. They're not even 13 years old. The people listening to this podcast now are grown adults. And the thing that we forget, because we're talking about us and we tend to not think too long or deeply about our own stuff, just kind of fleetingly and repeatedly. So we stay on this kind of superficial level of inquiry about ourselves. And when you stay on that superficial level of inquiry, where it's like, well, I'm talking about me, I'm talking about me, I'm talking about me. And you don't think deeply enough about it. But if you think a little bit deeper for a second, you're not actually talking about you. When you're asking why, when it comes to your trauma, you're not actually asking about you. You're asking about the old you. Now, there is a chance you're asking about the new you. It depends on what your why question is, right? And that's why is so dangerous. The question can have anything at the end of it to give it some specificity. We could just yell, why, at the universe and not get much of an answer because it's not much of a question. But we can make it more specific and try to get to a specific answer. And when it comes to trauma, when we reflect on our trauma, when we remember our trauma, we are in some way partially re-traumatized, if that trauma is still living inside of us. If it's not, then we're not still traumatized. But if we are still traumatized, then by some event in our past, and we reflect on that event, we relive a portion of that in our memory. And that makes a portion of our body respond to that memory and relive a percentage, maybe, of that event. Which means that our physiology in that moment that we are remembering this event, if it is traumatic, is no longer in a state of peace. Our physiology has changed into a more stressed state. How much more is totally dependent, but we are in a more stressed state, which means we aren't thinking that well. And if you're not thinking clearly when you're reflecting on trauma, it's probably just going to wind up re-traumatizing you. And This shows up in the questions that we choose to ask following why when it comes to our trauma. We ask, why did this happen to me? Why didn't they protect me? Why did they do this to me? Why did I deserve this? Why was I left? Why is the world so mean? What's happening here is you're asking the wrong questions. If you ask the wrong question, you're going to get the wrong answer. When we ask these questions, we are unknowingly asking our adult brain here and now today in a dysregulated state to solve a problem that was imprinted on the child's brain. I understand it was still your brain. I understand it was still my brain, but it wasn't really. Not in the way that we conceptualize it with the way that we think now. Like I said, we think about ourselves, but we don't think deeply about ourselves. We think often and shallowly about ourselves. That's the way the mind works. It just bounces from one thing to the next. So when we ask these questions of ourselves or of the universe, why did this happen? Why didn't they protect me? Why weren't they better parents? What we're doing is, one, often we're asking unsolvable questions. Questions that won't get any answer. There is no actual factual way to get an answer. We're just asking why because we have pain and we want to solve that pain. But what we're actually asking here is we're asking our adult brain to solve a problem that was imprinted on a child's brain. And if we're not careful with the way that we think about the questions and move toward an answer, we're going to wind up screwing ourselves over. What happens when we ask about our trauma to our adult brains is we're asking a much more complicated and convoluted system to make sense of a much more rudimentary one. We're asking our adult brain to make sense of what happened in this much more rudimentary childlike brain. The adult brain, now, you and I, our brains, have learned so many justifications and nuances and contradictory themes and principles that it's like almost impossible for us to solve the question why with any accuracy, especially when we're asking why about what happened to such a rudimentary system. Those questions, why did this happen to me? Why didn't they protect me? Why did they do this to me? Why did I deserve this? These kinds of questions, it's all about deservedness and why did these things happen to me? Asking why is fundamental to the human animal. It's fundamental to our species. It's fundamental to our science and to our advancement and to our society and cultures and civilizations. But when it comes to trauma, one of the definitions I have for trauma is inappropriate circumstances, adapted to appropriately. And if the circumstance was inappropriate, in a way, it couldn't have been predicted. If it was inappropriate, it shouldn't have happened. And it's hard to make sense of things that should not have happened. Which means that the answers don't just live inside of us. Like a lot of the answers, I believe a lot of the most important answers in the world do reside inside of us. They reside inside our flesh, inside our intuition and our emotional systems. Not exclusively, but I believe that they exist in the interplay of our mental and emotional and physical systems. And since the answer doesn't live inside of us, we have to look for it somewhere outside of ourselves. And the answer lies in our biology and has been solved thanks to developmental psychology and polyvagal theory. The normal why questions lead us down an unsolvable road. When you ask why about things that never should have happened, we're seeking to make sense of a situation that does not make sense. There are things that happen in life and we just don't know why. This is why asking why is such a dangerous game in trauma. When you try to solve all of the problems, you're trying to make sense of a senseless act. Therefore, any conclusion that you come to is also going to be somewhat senseless, which means it's not going to be satisfying, which means we're going to keep looking for answers, which means we're going to stay focused on the question, and the question is focused on the trauma and the bad things. So I think we've established that asking why is the single most dangerous question in trauma, especially complex trauma. But There is one place, I believe that there's one, there may be more, but there's one question that it's okay to ask. The one question that I think is safe to ask in trauma is, why did I react the way that I did? Why am I carrying the ripple effects of the trauma? That question. Why did I react the way that I did? Why did I wind up with the story that I wound up with? Kind of two versions of the same question. Why am I carrying what I'm carrying because of my trauma? And because of my trauma is not an answer. I want something more specific. And the reason I think that this is an okay question to ask is because the answer doesn't live inside you. The answer is outside of you. And the other questions, why did this happen to me? Why didn't they protect me? Why did I deserve this? Why did they do this to me? Those kinds of questions can't really be answered in any kind of way that's going to provide any peace. But asking, why did I react the way that I did? Why am I still reacting the way that I do? Those questions can be asked, and they can be answered in a legitimate way. And that legitimate way has come to us through polyvagal theory. So like I said before, you were a helpless child. I was a helpless child. When we went through our trauma, at whatever age, you were a child. I was a child. And I'm not a laboratory scientist or a researcher. I'm a developmental trauma CPTSD survivor with ADHD and moderate to severe alcoholism and a touch of bipolar if you were to dig through my medical records. And what I've learned in my quest for self-understanding through the years is that there are real biological limitations and expectations that come with development. There is a process that you've heard me talk about in the episode on polyvagal theory called neuroception. Neuroception is a process completed by your autonomic nervous system, the automatic nervous system, the one that you don't need to tell to do stuff, and it does everything for you. And I really mean it does nearly everything. It does like 90% of all of our work for us. And one of the things that it does, because we're a living, breathing being on an interdependent planet where everything eats and kills each other except for us now, but because our biology was designed and it co-evolved with nature, we have built-in systems that help us stay alive in this wild, jungled world that we have removed ourselves from entirely. And one of the ways that we maintain safety, so we don't die, so we can make more babies for ourselves, is through neuroception. And neuroception is just constantly scanning the environment to see if we're safe. And it uses all kinds of different mechanisms and sensors and integration techniques. But the process of scanning the environment to see if I am safe, the biggest piece you need to understand about it is that it is subconscious. And the next biggest piece you need to understand about it is all the time. Through neuroception, it's constantly regulating your heart rate and regulating your breathing. It's regulating your vasodilation. It's helping with all of the stuff happening behind the scenes. It's replicating your liver cells and all that. That's the autonomic nervous system. And proprioceptor and neuroception is making sure that you are safe. And importantly, because it's through the autonomic nervous system, it happens subconsciously, which is really good for us because it happens faster than conscious thought does. All unconscious things happen faster than conscious thought does. That's why we're constantly going, well, I wasn't thinking. Young people especially, I wasn't thinking, because they're doing stuff faster out of reaction than their brain is able to keep up consciously. And when we feel threatened by anything, by stress, we have a few basic defense mechanisms that we have evolved to launch in order to maintain our safety. When we notice a threat, the first thing that we can do is go to the group. right? You can think of a band of monkeys, or I mean, really anything, but you can think of a band of monkeys, a troop of monkeys, out of whatever a group of monkeys is called. And if you see a lion on the prairie or whatever, on the savannah, if you see a lion on the savannah as a little monkey, the first thing that you can do, especially because if it's far off, you just go join the group, because no lion is going to take on an entire pack of baboons. So that's the first step. And this happens in this order for absolutely everybody, because this is what our biology tells us through polyvagal theory, is the first step that our species launches in order to maintain or achieve safety is to socialize. That can just be moving closer to the pack when we notice a threat. It can be going and bonding with our caregiver as a child. But that first step is always social engagement. And that happens through the ventral vagus that we covered in the polyvagal episode. Then the next step, if that doesn't work, if we go join the group, but then suddenly 12 more lions come out, and now it's going to be like a whole pride of lions against a whole pack of baboons, then we're like, oh, what happens next? Well, now we need to fight or run away. Either way, all this like chilling like a villain energy that we had is out the window, and the social engagement thing is no longer working to keep us engaged. So that system kind of shuts down, and we move into fight or flight, the sympathetic middle vagal branch. That shunts blood where it's supposed to be to get us ready to fight or to run away. And thirdly, if that doesn't work, if fighting or run away doesn't work, then we can play dead. We can do like a possum or a lizard or whatever and just play dead. And that is a strategy, that is the final strategy that we have in order to immobilize ourselves as a way to find safety. So 3 ways that we find safety. The first one, and it always happens in this order, is social engagement. The second one is sympathetic fight or flight. And then the third and last ditch effort is the immobilization freeze fawn. Now, the reason that this is important is, why did I react this way? Why did I react like the way that I did? You reacted the way that you did because your biology demanded it of you. I hope this is beginning to land. What I'm saying is, you may not have known about these strategies. You probably didn't. You may not have known about polyvagal theory and the hierarchy of these nervous system circuits, but they're real, and they command our biology much more than your personality did. And that's the key. This is what I want everybody to hear. When our ANS, that autonomic nervous system, detects a threat, our DNA, not our personality, not our character, tells us to first try to connect with another human being. That's the first thing that happens. And if that doesn't work, then we move into fight or flight. And if that doesn't work, then we move into freeze or fawn. But we don't get a choice in this. And that's the point. Most childhood trauma is based around not having a secure connection with our caregivers, which means that we automatically miss out on building the neurological tendency towards socializing as a way to cope with stress. Do you get that yet? So we always will try this social engagement, then fight or flight, then disengagement. And it will always happen in that way at first. Then through conditioning, when one of those strategies is repeatedly successful, we tend to launch that strategy exclusively. So when it comes to all of these why questions, why am I the way that I am? Why am I broken? Why did these things happen to me? Why didn't they just care? Why couldn't they have been there for me? All of those questions lead you down a path that is unsolvable, and you deserve answers to those questions. I'm not saying that you don't, but you're probably never going to get them. And that's the shitty part. those first sets of questions, you're probably never going to get answers to them. They are unanswerable. But these other questions that ask about why you are still living with the things left over from your childhood, where they came from, how you became the person that you are, how you got here, why am I the way that I am as a result of my trauma, that can be answered. But you have to actually dig for the answer. And the answer is you are the way that you are because your body chose strategies before you ever had a chance to. So the reason that you respond to trauma the way that you do is because in your situation, whatever it may have been, the strategies that you launch now were the strategies that were the most successful then. Now, if you're much, much older in life, if you're in your 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, then you may not be acting out of those same traumatic responses from childhood. You may have learned over time through conditioning as an adult that fawning and freezing isn't the best way, and you became a fighter because you're counterbalancing those years of fawning and freezing. Now, maybe that happens through conditioning later, but for most of us, when we are first digging into looking at like how we got injured and how that affects our lives now, most of those people are in 20s and 30s and 40s and looking at raising kids, and we're still acting out those same habits from childhood that were strategies that we launched as a way to survive the inappropriate circumstances that we were in. Which is why is such a dangerous question. Why is unanswerable most of the time. But occasionally you can get to the answer. And as far as I'm concerned, if your why doesn't lead you to a biological conclusion, you're probably screwed. Whatever your why question is, you're probably screwed because you probably aren't going to get an answer to it. Now, this is unfortunate for most trauma baby people. When I tell you this, don't get too mad at me, or do, whatever. The reality for all of us is hyper-independence is a trauma response. Most of us know that. We become super independent, and we don't think about the nuts and bolts like mechanism of action as to why that happens, but we understand that it does happen, and it seems totally understandable. It's like, okay, yeah, people hurt you, so you don't do that. And it literally is that simple. But the understanding the biology underneath that when we were babies, that social engagement circuit, that ventral vagus, is how we were supposed to bond to our caregivers. And if we didn't have that, or bonding to our caregivers led us to being abused or inconsistently getting our needs met, then bonding with our caregivers was unsafe. So we learned to not rely on that first step. Whereas if you did consistently get most or all of your needs met as a child, then whenever something is wrong, you're just going to call a friend or like talk about it, or go hang out with somebody and maybe not even talk about it at all, because you can automatically re-regulate just by being around other people, because that is what your life experience has conditioned you to do to deal with stress. Whereas people who had developmental trauma or trauma in childhood, which often becomes complex trauma, that association is not there. Most of our trauma comes from a lack of connection with our caregivers. And that doesn't mean that they didn't love us or they didn't want to do their best for us or whatever. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. I feel like most of the time they do. There are the occasional super fuck ups, but for the most part, I think parents try, and then they're screwed up. So we are screwed up. And we don't get to bond with them, so we don't rely on that neurological network. So when we want to go or we're told to go socialize and be around other people, that is super duper hard for us, because we have decades of experience that leaning on social engagement as a re-regulation technique when we get stressed and launch a stress response just doesn't work for us. And the thing is, that's a personality trait that we have adopted and been like, this is me, that is exclusively from trauma. Like, nobody, no human being is born an introvert. No human being is an island. We can't be. Our species is designed not to be. The machine that we ride in, these meat suits, are designed to work together with other clever meat suits to make the world easier for our meat suits to live in. That's how we are designed. So no one is an island, and nobody is born antisocial. Like, that's not a natural personality trait. I think some people are more social, some people are less social, but people who identify as antisocial, myself very much included, not so much now, but I was very antisocial. And the reason is because sociability was never a strategy that worked for me in my life. So I just wanted to say that real quick for those folk like me who are antisocial and like only go out at night and all of that kind of thing. That's great. Do you, boo-boo. But just also recognize that you got about a 98% chance that that is directly the result of not getting your needs met as an infant or as a baby. And the problem with this is when that social engagement circuit is not turned on, we only have access to the extreme sympathetic and the extreme parasympathetic. Meaning we don't have access to these blended states that I talked about in the polyvagal episode. Blended states being a combination of sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the blended state would be play for social engagement and sympathetic. And a blended state would be rest and digest for social engagement and parasympathetic. That dorsal parasympathetic. If we don't have that social engagement network turned on because of a lifetime of social disappointment, then when we are agitated beyond what we can manage in a blended state, because that social circuit acts as the dimmer switch. Without the social circuit being well established and turned on regularly, we have on and off for sympathetic and parasympathetic, meaning we only have access to fight and flight and to freeze and fawn. We don't have access to play or sex even, and we don't have access to rest and digest. So if we choose to stay antisocial and leave that as a part of, especially a big part of our personality, we are guaranteeing ourselves to have a battle with anxiety and depression for the rest of our lives. That's just a fact because of the nuts and bolts of our biology. I'm sorry about it, but that's literally the only options that we have. That's the way that we understand and know that the biology works. Those are physical branches of the vagus nerve, the dorsal, sympathetic, and ventral. These are physical branches of the nervous system. This is not just a concept. This is an analog happening inside of our bodies. So for those of us with trauma, focusing the question of why, all that does is make us relive the traumatic instances and spin us down a cycle of questions that can never actually have answers. But if you can find a question that leads you to something concrete, like this biological answer, that might actually be helpful. But asking why about almost anything else in trauma is a recipe for absolute disaster because you can't solve it. There is no sensible explanation for a senseless act. And what we experienced was senseless. Even if we understand it now with our adult brains And we're like, oh, mom couldn't do this, and she was working 3 jobs and all of these things. Those are very true. And those are reasons that your mother deserves a pass, but they do not negate the trauma that lives inside you as a result of her real world limitations. Does that make sense? Please, I really hope that makes sense, because this is kind of the take home for me. Like, we have to ask why as a species. I think it's in our nature. We ask why about everything. Be around a 2 or 3 year old, there's a development chunk of time where you just get like a full year of why. And I think that's great. We want to understand things. It's a natural question for the human species to ask. And it has done incredible things for us. It has got us to the moon and back. It has got it's got thousands now of satellites up in the sky and fixed orbit with the Earth, like just incredible things. But we were asking why in those situations to understand fundamental truths about the universe, and then to leverage those fundamental truths about physics and cosmology. We asked so we could understand the hardware, the nuts and bolts of how the physics actually worked. That way we could leverage those physics to do what we wanted to do. And that is the only time, and I mean the only time, that you should ask why in trauma. As a traumatized person, you should be asking why, and your questions, your why questions. The question is the most important part of good science. You have to ask the right questions to get the right answer. And in trauma, I think it's even more high stakes. You have to ask the right whys. And when you're asking why about the traumatic situations that you have lived through, or that when somebody else is talking and that they've lived through, and you're witnessing them go through that process, if the end result of that question, if the answer to that question isn't a fundamental principle of the world that we live in, it's probably not going to be helpful. But if it is, like this answer, the reason that you did respond, the reason that you responded the way that you did, and you still respond the way that you do, is because of this hierarchy that gets launched in our biology when exposed to stress, regardless of our personality or character or moral fortitude. It's that hierarchy followed by conditioning that is unique to each of our circumstances, which means it had to have happened that way. You know, when you think about something, especially something fucked up for a really long time, and like weeks or months or years even, and then you finally come to the conclusion of it couldn't have been any other way. It had to have happened that way. Maybe it doesn't happen that often for you, but I'm sure that you've had at least 1 or 2 experiences like that. This is that for me. I've thought about trauma for so long now, from as many angles as I possibly could, that I've been led back to that answer. It happened that way because it couldn't have happened any other way. Given the real world circumstances of my mother or father or the foster homes or wherever and whatever situations you were raised in, there were real world limitations there. And then they responded understandably to those, and it rippled down onto me. Now, that's not to say that what happened is excusable. And if it was excusable or reasonable, it doesn't mean it wasn't traumatic. Please hear that. Just because something happened to you that was traumatic was reasonable and understandable, that doesn't negate the trauma. Just because something traumatic happened to you that you later on as an adult now realize was reasonable because of the real world limitations on your care providers or whatever, that doesn't negate that the trauma is alive and well inside you and wants to be dealt with. So I'll leave that there. You responded the way that you did to your trauma because your DNA, my DNA, is programmed to respond in the exact same order every time for the whole species. And it will do that over and over and over until one of those responses tends to be the dominant one that has the most success. And then we will lean on that one. And trauma lives in us because our social engagement ventral vagal network didn't work. And that's what allows us to have a dimmer switch on our sympathetic and parasympathetic. I mean, trauma lives in us because we either shut down or we ramp up way too hard. And that's because we don't have dimmer switches. I mean, we don't have dimmer switches because part of our trauma was from a lack of the social connection, and that's social bonding. And that's not just your brain is weak because you didn't do that. No, it's bigger than that. It's a biological reality. So when you ask why, make sure that you understand that if the end result of that question can't be a biological one, it's not useful. The reason we ask questions is to get answers that help us. So ask the right question. Why is the single most dangerous question in complex trauma? So be really careful with it and understand that you are the way you are because you had to be. Thank you so much for listening. If you made it this far in the podcast, I appreciate you listening all the way to the end. If you like the podcast, consider becoming a Patreon member or buy me a coffee. All the links are attached below. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate you guys. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.